October 15, 1844. In a quiet German village, a child is born. He is not born into royalty, nor into immense wealth. He is born into a world of books, faith, and quiet contemplation. But this child, Friedrich Nietzsche, is destined to ignite a fire that would challenge everything the world thought it knew about life, morality, and God. Today, we see him as a titan of philosophy, a mind whose ideas echo in the halls of academia and the depths of our cultural consciousness. But in his own time, he was a ghost, a pariah. His thoughts were not just radical, they were considered dangerous. His books collected dust on shelves, his name a punchline among the intellectuals who dominated the era. Nietzsche wasn't a philosopher of the armchair variety. He didn't build abstract theories for the sake of intellectual games. He was a physician of the soul. He wanted to fundamentally change how human beings experience their existence. But the truth, as he would discover, comes at a terrible price. For years, Nietzsche wandered Europe in isolation, a nomad battling crippling illness, poverty, and a profound loneliness. In the end, the very mind that declared war on the world's illusions would be consumed by its own internal darkness. So what was it? What did Nietzsche see that others could not? He believed humanity was living a beautiful, comforting, and utterly devastating lie. He argued that for centuries, religion and traditional morality had sold us a set of values that didn't empower us, but systematically weakened us, turning vibrant human beings into a herd of timid, obedient sheep. God is dead. This is his most infamous declaration. Not a cry of atheistic triumph, but a stark diagnosis. Nietzsche wasn't celebrating the death of religion. He was sounding an alarm. He saw that the world was hurtling into a new age, an age where the old maps, the old gods, and the old rules would no longer apply. But if God is dead, what is left? This terrifying question led Nietzsche into the abyss of nihilism, the chilling void that opens when we realize there is no preordained purpose to the universe, no cosmic script for our lives. How do you live without absolute truth? How do you find meaning in a world without gods or masters? Nietzsche didn't just tear down the old idols. He offered a path forward, a way to climb out of the nihilistic pit. He spoke of the overman, the will to power, and the eternal return, ideas so potent they could forever alter the way we perceive our own existence. But confronting these truths is not for the faint of heart. Nietzsche knew this better than anyone. His ideas were a fire, and that fire ultimately consumed him. This is the story of the man who stared into the abyss, who tried to decode the universe, and who paid the ultimate price for his vision. This is the story of Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche's story begins in Rücken, a small village in the Prussian province of Saxony. Born on October 15, 1844, his early life was steeped in Lutheran piety. His father, a pastor, was a figure of gentle authority, but tragedy struck early. When Friedrich was just 5 years old, his father died, leaving him in a household dominated by women. His mother, his younger sister Elizabeth, his grandmother, and 2 aunts. This environment shaped a boy who was serious, introverted, and intensely reflective. From a young age, he displayed an extraordinary intellect. While other children played, Nietzsche was lost in music, literature, and classical studies. He seemed destined for a brilliant, if conventional, academic career, perhaps following in his father's footsteps. He enrolled at the University of Bonn to study theology and classical philology. The path was set, but within him, the seeds of doubt were already sprouting. He began to rigorously question the Christian faith he was raised in, finding himself unable to reconcile its doctrines with his burgeoning philosophical inquiries. He abandoned theology, dedicating himself entirely to the study of ancient Greek and Roman texts. His genius was undeniable. At the astonishingly young age of 24, he was appointed a professor of classical philology at the University of Basel in Switzerland. It was an unprecedented achievement. For a moment it seemed Nietzsche had found his place, a secure, respected position in the academic world. But security was never his goal. He was hunting for something far more elusive: the truth. Despite his intellectual prowess, his life was a catalogue of suffering. From his youth, he was plagued by debilitating health problems, excruciating migraines that would leave him blind for days, chronic digestive issues, and a constant, draining fatigue. His eyesight was so poor he was nearly blind. Many days were spent in a darkened room, incapacitated by pain. This relentless physical torment forced him to resign from his professorship at just 34 years old. From that point on, Nietzsche became a wanderer. He drifted across Europe, Switzerland, Italy, France, in a desperate search for a climate that might soothe his ailments. He lived a life of stark simplicity and profound isolation. His routine was monastic, long walks through the mountains in the morning where he would wrestle with his ideas, followed by afternoons of furious, non-stop writing. It was in this crucible of solitude and suffering that he forged his most revolutionary works. Thus spoke Zarathustra, where he introduced the world to the concept of the Übermensch, or Overman, beyond good and evil, a blistering critique of traditional morality, and on the genealogy of morality, where he excavated the very origins of our values. But there was a problem. The world wasn't listening. Nietzsche was writing for a future he would never see. His books didn't sell. His ideas were dismissed as the bizarre ramblings of an eccentric. He spent years in complete obscurity, ignored by the academic establishment and the wider culture. His solitary nature and his unsparing critique of humanity left him with few friends. One of the most significant relationships of his life was with the composer Richard Wagner, whom he initially revered as a kindred spirit, an artist who could usher in a new cultural era. But their philosophical paths diverged, and the eventual break with Wagner became one of the great disappointments of Nietzsche's life. He never married, had no family of his own. He lived, and he died, alone. Yet his mind never stopped. Even as his body and spirit deteriorated, he continued to write with a feverish intensity, pushing himself until there was nothing left to give. In January 1889, on a street in Turin, Italy, something inside him finally broke. He suffered a complete mental collapse, reportedly after witnessing a horse being flogged and rushing to embrace it, weeping. He had seen too much. He had thought too much. His fragile health could no longer bear the weight of his own mind. Nietzsche would spend the last 11 years of his life in a state of silent dementia, cared for by his mother and later his sister. The man who wrote, "When you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you," had finally been swallowed by it. He lived his life in the shadows, but today his thought illuminates the entire world. Since the dawn of consciousness, humanity has been haunted by a single, relentless question: why do we suffer? Religion, philosophy, and morality have all been attempts to make sense of the pain, the injustice, the fear, and the sacrifice that shadow us from birth to death. For nearly 2 millennia, Christianity offered a powerful and pervasive answer. Suffering, it taught, is part of a divine plan. It is a test of faith, a trial to be endured with humility. This earthly world is merely a stepping stone, a temporary passage to something greater. Our true destiny lies in the afterlife, in a heaven where all suffering will cease and an eternal reward awaits. But what if this entire framework was a lie? A dangerous trap? Nietzsche believed it was. In his view, the promise of a future paradise was a poison that made people devalue their real, tangible lives. It encouraged a culture of resignation, guilt, and self-denial, teaching people to passively accept their lot in this world in exchange for a fantasy in the next. In his masterwork, On the Genealogy of Morality, Nietzsche performed a philosophical excavation, digging down to the roots of the values we call good and evil. His conclusion was unsettling. Traditional morality was not born from a desire to help humanity flourish, but from a need to hold it back. Nietzsche explained that in ancient pre-Christian societies, the concept of good was entirely different. It was associated with strength, courage, nobility, and power. The strong, independent individual who asserted their will upon the world was considered good. Conversely, the weak, the timid, the dependent, they were bad. But then a revolution occurred, a transvaluation of all values. Suddenly, humility, obedience, and even suffering were rebranded as virtues. Strength, ambition, and the desire for self-overcoming were condemned as selfish, wicked vices. For Nietzsche, this was a brilliant and insidious strategy conceived by the weak to control the strong. He called it a slave revolt in morality. The resentful, those who lacked the power to achieve greatness in the real world, created a moral system that benefited them, giving them a sense of superiority. This was the birth of what he termed slave morality, a set of values that preaches submission, sacrifice, and the denial of one's own instincts. Traditional religion and morality, he argued, taught us that pleasure is sin, that desire is dangerous, and that the right thing to do is to suppress our passions in the name of a higher unseen power. But Nietzsche posed the question, why should we deny the very essence of our nature? As science and reason began to chip away at the foundations of faith, belief in God and religious values started to wane. Nietzsche observed that the modern world no longer revolved around religion, but this was not a cause for celebration. It was, in his eyes, a crisis of monumental proportions, because if God no longer held sway in the minds of people, then the entire value system that Western civilization had been built upon for centuries would crumble. God is dead, and we have killed him. With this chilling proclamation, Nietzsche announced the end of an era. The problem wasn't the death of God itself, but what would come after. If there is no God, what is left? Without a divine purpose, a pre-written destiny, and absolute moral law, the human being is left utterly alone in a silent, indifferent universe. This feeling of existential vertigo is what Nietzsche called nihilism. Nihilism is the realization that nothing has objective meaning, that there is no universal purpose to existence. And this can be terrifying. Imagine waking up one day to find that everything you believed in has lost its value. There is no God to guide you, no absolute truth to tell you what is right or wrong, no ultimate reason to get out of bed in the morning. This is the crisis Nietzsche feared. When the old beliefs die, people become lost, adrift, desperately searching for something new to cling to. Often they fall for new illusions just as dangerous as the old ones. Nihilism is an abyss, but Nietzsche did not want humanity to fall into despair. He was not a philosopher of pessimism, but of overcoming. If God is dead, then it is up to us to create new meaning for our lives. Instead of being consumed by the void, we must learn to live without crutches, without dogmas, without imposed truths. We must become the creators of our own destiny. And it is here that Nietzsche introduces his grand solution: the overman, the will to power, and the eternal return. The problem of human suffering, he suggests, is not the world's fault. It's a fault in our perspective. If we can change how we see life, we can transform suffering into growth, into strength, into the raw energy needed to create something new. But to do that, we must dare to question everything. And that is one of Nietzsche's most powerful and most dangerous ideas. Because facing the truth isn't easy. Most people prefer the comfort of familiar beliefs. It's easier to follow a pre-made path than to build your own. But Nietzsche tells us that true freedom only arrives when we accept reality as it is. There is no heaven or hell. There is no cosmic purpose. There is no universal truth. All that exists is this moment, right now. And the question is, what are you going to do with it? Nietzsche didn't just diagnose the problem of human suffering and the crisis of nihilism. He proposed a solution, a radical, life-affirming path forward. If God is dead and traditional values have collapsed, humanity stands at a crossroads. One path leads down into the void of nihilism, a life without meaning or direction. The other path leads up towards taking control of our own existence and creating a new purpose for ourselves. Nietzsche believed that most people, the herd, as he unflatteringly called them, would choose the first path. They prefer to follow imposed rules, to seek comfort in external beliefs, and to avoid the terrifying responsibility of creating their own destiny. But a few, the bravest, the strongest in spirit, could choose the second path. They would be the pioneers of a new humanity. They would be the Übermensch. In his poetic masterpiece, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche introduces this concept, often translated as the Overman or Superman. Who is the Overman? The Overman is the individual who breaks free from the lies of traditional morality and creates their own meaning in life. They do not seek approval or follow values imposed by society. They are the master of their own fate. They do not fear nihilism because they understand that the absence of preordained meaning is not a problem, but an opportunity. They do not search for absolute truths because they know that all values are human creations. They are not ruled by guilt or fear because they understand that suffering is an integral part of existence, a catalyst for growth. They harness their energy and their desire for self-overcoming rather than repressing them in the name of an external moral code. The Overman is an artist of their own life. Instead of accepting rules from the outside, they decide what is important to them and live in accordance with their own vision of the world. To become this creator, Nietzsche argued, we must tap into a fundamental force that exists within all living things, the will to power, der Wille zur Macht. What is the will to power? It is not, as it has often been misinterpreted, a crude desire to dominate others. It is the innate natural impulse of all life to grow, to expand, to overcome obstacles, and to express its strength. It is the energy that drives us to seek new challenges, to improve ourselves, to evolve. In modern society, however, this will has been suppressed. Traditional morality teaches us to be content, to be docile, to accept our place without question. Nietzsche says no. We were not born to obey. We were born to create. The will to power is not about being cruel to others, but about being strong enough to face reality without illusions. It's not about selfishness, but about living with intensity, free from the fear of external judgment. Human history is filled with individuals who embodied this idea. Great artists, scientists, explorers, and thinkers who defied the norms of their time to create something new. But to activate our own will to power, we must first free ourselves from fear. And to do that, Nietzsche gives us a radical thought experiment, an ultimate test to determine if we are truly living the life we want. He calls it the eternal return. Imagine that. At the moment of your death, you were condemned to repeat your life, over and over again, exactly as it was, for all eternity. Every choice, every mistake, every moment of joy and suffering, all of it, repeated infinitely. Would you embrace this fate with joy, or would you see it as a curse? If your answer is the latter, it means you are not living the life you truly desire. So, what are you going to do about it? This idea of the eternal return is not meant to be taken literally. Nietzsche wasn't claiming that time is cyclical. It is a philosophical tool, a psychological weight designed to evaluate our lives. If every single moment were to be repeated forever, shouldn't we strive to make our existence worthy of that repetition? Live in such a way, Nietzsche challenges us, that you would be willing to relive it countless times. Live with pride, not regret. Nietzsche had no patience for conformity. He could not accept a world where human beings lived crushed under the weight of values imposed by others. For him, the true meaning of life is not found by following an external purpose, but by creating it from within. How do we overcome the crisis of nihilism? By ceasing our search for absolute truths and accepting that each individual must create their own meaning. By embracing our will to power instead of repressing our desires and ambitions, and by living in such a way that we could welcome the eternal return without fear or regret. We are not slaves to a pre-written destiny. We are the creators of our own reality. Nietzsche challenges us to wake up, to stop being victims of an imposed morality, and to take control of our existence. He knew his ideas were not for everyone. Most people prefer the comfort of tradition to the uncertainty of freedom. But a few are willing to challenge the rules and create their own values. The question is, are you one of them? Nietzsche's final years were a portrait of his own philosophy's tragic side. He lived in isolation, his books unread, his ideas misunderstood. After his mental collapse in 1889, the philosopher who had given the world so much to think about fell into a decade of silence. He never recovered his sanity. When you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. Perhaps Nietzsche saw too much. Perhaps the truths he uncovered were too immense for one man to bear, and he was ultimately consumed by his own vision. But his legacy is immortal. The books that were once ignored are now studied in every corner of the globe. His ideas have profoundly influenced modern philosophy, psychology, art, and culture. He taught us to think for ourselves, to challenge the rules, to live without fear, and to love our fate. Amor fati. Perhaps Nietzsche wasn't mad. Perhaps he was simply the first to see the terrifying, liberating truth of the modern world, long before anyone else was ready. He leaves us with a challenge, a question that echoes through time. In a world without gods, without absolute truths, without a pre-written script, how will you choose to live? What meaning will you create? What will you do with the precious, fleeting time you have? The answer depends only on you.